Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost of the one true God, back with you with the next video in my series reading The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Without further ado, returning to The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn as read by Lord Naren White.
That's what they all do, and he's got to. Huck, you don't ever seem to want to do anything that's regular. You want to be starting something fresh all the time. Suppose he don't do nothing with it. Ain't it there in his bed? For a clue after he's gone. And don't you reckon they'll want clues? Of course they will. And you wouldn't leave them any. That would be a pretty howdy-do, wouldn't it? I never heard of such a thing. Well, I says, if it's in the regulations and he's got to have it, all right. Let him have it, because I don't wish to go back on no regulations. But there's one thing, Tom Sawyer. If we go to tearing up our sheets to make Jim a rope ladder, we're going to get into trouble with Aunt Sally, just as sure as you're born. Now, the way I look at it, a hickory bark ladder don't cost nothing, and don't waste nothing, and is just as good to load up a pie with, and hide in a straw tick, as any rag ladder you can start. And as for Jim, he ain't had no experience, and so he don't care what kind of a... Oh, shucks, Huck Finn. If I was as ignorant as you, I'd keep still, that's what I'd do. Who ever heard of a state prisoner escaping by a hickory bark ladder? Why is it perfectly ridiculous? Well, all right, Tom. Fix it your own way. But if you'll take my advice, you'll let me borrow a sheet off of the clothesline.
He said that would do, and that gave him another idea, and he says,
Borrow a shirt, too. What do we want of a shirt, Tom? Want it for Jim to keep a journal on. Journal your granny. Jim can't write. Suppose he can't write. He can make marks on the shirt, can't he? If we make him a pen out of an old pewter spoon or a piece of an old iron barrel hoop. Why, Tom, we can pull a feather out of a goose and make him a better one, and quicker too. Prisoners don't have geese running around the dungeon keep to pull pens out of, you muggins. They always make their pens out of the hardest, toughest, troublesomest piece of old brass candlestick or something like that they can get their hands on. And it takes them weeks and weeks and months to file it out, too, because they've got to do it by rubbing it on the wall. They wouldn't use a goose quill if they had it. It ain't regular. Well, then, what'll we make him the ink out of? Many makes it out of iron rust and tears, but that's the common sort in woman. The best authorities uses their own blood. Jim can do that. And when he wants to send any little common, ordinary, mysterious message to let the world know where he's captivated, he can write it on the bottom of a tin plate with a fork and throw it out of the window. The Iron Mask always done that, and it's a blame good way too. Jim ain't got no tin plates. They feed him in a pan. That ain't nothing. We can get him some. Can't nobody read his plates. That ain't got anything to do with it, Huck Finn. All he's got to do is write on the plate and throw it out. You don't have to be able to read it. Why, half the time you can't read anything a prisoner writes on a tin plate or anywhere else. Well then, what's the sense in wasting the plates? Why blame it all? It ain't the prisoner's plates. But it's somebody's plates, ain't it? Well, supposing it is. What does the prisoner care whose?
He broke off there, because we heard the breakfast horn blowing. So we cleared out for the house. During the morning I borrowed a sheet and a white shirt off the clothesline, and I found an old sack and put them in it, and we went down and got the foxfire and put that in too. I called it borrowing, because that was what Pap always called it, but Tom said it weren't borrowing, it was stealing. He said we was representing prisoners, and prisoners don't care how they get a thing, so they get it, and nobody don't blame them for it either. It ain't no crime in a prisoner to steal the thing he needs to get away with, Tom said. It's his right. And so, as long as we was representing a prisoner, we had a perfect right to steal anything on his place we had the least use for to get ourselves out of prison with. He said if we weren't prisoners, it would be a different thing, and nobody but a mean, ordinary person would steal when he weren't a prisoner. So we allowed we would steal everything there that was come handy. And yet, he made a mighty fuss one day after that, when I stole a watermelon out of the black patch and eat it. And he made me go and give the blacks a dime without telling them what it was for. Tom said that what he meant was we could steal anything we needed. Well, I says, I needed the watermelon, but he said I didn't need it to get out of prison with. There's where the difference was. He said if I'd wanted to hide a knife in and smuggle it to Jim to kill the seneschal with, it would have been all right. So I let it go at that, though I couldn't see no advantage in my representing a prisoner. If I got to set down a chaw over a lot of gold leaf distinctions like that every time, I see a chance to hog a watermelon. Well, as I was saying, we waited that morning till everybody was settled down to business, and nobody in sight around the yard. Then Tom, he carried the sack into the lean-to whilst I stood off a piece to keep watch. By and by he come out, and we went and sat down on the woodpile to talk. He says, "Everything's all right now except tools, and that's easy fixed." "Tools?" I says. "Yes." "Tools for what?" "Why, to dig with. We ain't a-going to gnaw him out, are we?" "Ain't them old crippled picks and things in there good enough to dig a black out with?" I says. He turns on me, looking pitying enough to make a body cry, and says, "Huck Finn, did you ever hear of a prisoner having picks and shovels and all the modern conveniences in his wardrobe to dig himself out with? Now I want to ask you, if you got any reasonableness in you at all, what kind of a show would that give him to be a hero? Why, they might as well lend him the key and done with it. Picks and shovels, why, they wouldn't furnish them to a king." "Well then," I says, "if we don't want the picks and shovels, what do we want?" "Couple of case knives." "To dig the foundations out from under that cabin with." "Yes? Confound it, it's foolish, Tom." "It don't make no difference how foolish it is. It's the right way and it's the regular way. And there ain't no other way that ever I heard of. And I've read all the books that gives any information about these things. They always dig out with a case knife and not through dirt. Mind you, generally, it's through solid rock. And it takes them weeks and weeks and weeks and forever and ever. Why, look at one of them prisoners in the bottom dungeon of that Castle d'If in the harbor of Marseille that dug himself out that way. How long was he at it, you reckon?" "I don't know." "Well, guess. I don't know, a month and a half? 37 year. And he come out in China. That's the kind. I wish the bottom of this fortress was solid rock." "Jim don't know nobody in China." "What's that got to do with it? Neither did that other fellow. But you're always wandering off on a side issue. Why can't you stick to the main point?" "All right. I don't care where he comes out. So he comes out. And Jim don't either, I reckon. But there's one thing anyway. Jim's too old to be dug out with a case knife. He won't last." "Yes, he will last, too. You don't reckon it's going to take 37 years to dig out through a dirt foundation, do you?" "How long will it take, Tom?" "Well, we can't risk being as long as we ought to, because it may not take very long for Uncle Silas to hear from down there by New Orleans. He'll hear Jim ain't from there. Then his next move will be to advertise Jim, or something like that. So we can't risk being as long digging him out as we ought to. By rights, I reckon we ought to be a couple of years, but we can't. Things being so uncertain, what I recommend is this, that we really dig right in, as quick as we can. And after that, we can let on, to ourselves, that we was at it 37 years. Then we can snatch him out and rush him away the first time there's an alarm. Yes, I reckon that'll be the best way." "Now, there's sense in that," I says. "Letting on don't cost nothing. Letting on ain't no trouble. And if it's any object, I don't mind letting on we was at 150 year. It wouldn't strain me none, after I got my hand in. So I'll mosey along now, and smouch a couple of case knives." "Smouch 3, he says. "We want one to make a saw out of." "Tom, if it ain't unregular and religious to suggest it," I said, "there's an old rusty saw blade around yonder sticking under the weather boarding behind the smoke house." He looked kind of weary and discouraged like, and says, "It ain't no use to try to learn you nothing, Huck. Run along and smouch the knives, 3 of them." So I done it. We'll go ahead and stop there for this week and pick up next week with chapter 36. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care, and thanks again.